Good morning, friends. Let's dive back into how the story ends. We're talking about what life will be like in God's eternal kingdom. We're taking some snapshots, or at least looking closely at the snapshots that God has given us about eternity, the guardrails He's set down to make sure that when we think about eternity, we think about things that are roughly accurate based off of what He has told us. And we've talked about the fact that the first thing that will happen, or the first big part of eternity, will be this idea of intimacy. That we will be, the dating is over, the engagement is over, the wedding has come, and on the other side of this wedding, there's an intimacy with our God that we never had before. We're going to be able to explore the inner workings of God's heart with no veil, no protective barrier to keep us out so we don't melt. Somehow we'll have the capacity to process this slowly over time. And I have a feeling that as we go deeper and deeper into eternity, we will know God more and we'll have more love for Him. Because again, eternity is the ultimate triumph of love. But then we talked about, just briefly at the end of last week's talk, about how our brokenness will be undone. And the word for that, the key word for that, is healing. And we started talking about how God will wipe away every tear from our eyes. And just how beautifully personal and intimate that is. How beautiful that is to sense God, when you cry about it for the last time, and He wipes away those tears, to realize that all of a sudden everything that you had missing is back. Everything that was broken is now fixed. Everything that was out of joint is now in place. And all of a sudden now you're whole again. You're whole again. But there's a few more things that God wants to banish from our existence, from our experience, right? Take a look at verse 4 of Revelation 21. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. So this verse is all about the former things from our old life, our old experience, that are not going to make it into this new world. And I have some good news for all of you. Death does not get to come and join us in the kingdom of God. That's the blank there, the second blank, the second star, or whatever you want to call it there. God will eliminate death at last. Death. Now, you remember, of course, right? Death was not an original part of God's creation. God did not design death into the program. Death is a bug. It is not a feature. Death comes along when humanity decides to step outside of the place God had assigned to them, which is to be the creature under the authority of the Creator. When they stepped out and decided, I'm going to do my own thing, God introduced death to them as a consequence of that. So if you're going to step out of what you ought to do and who you ought to be, you're going to be disconnected from the source of life that keeps you going, which is God Himself. And so you're disconnected from God, you are technically dead. At some point, your body is going to catch up to your spirit, and your body is going to fall over and die. But even at that moment when you're physically alive, your spirit, the immaterial part of you, has been unplugged from God and therefore does not have access to life. But that was never the plan. That was never what God intended. That was never what God wanted for us. God wanted us to experience eternal life. And in fact, if you look back in chapter 20, verse 14, you remember that final judgment where God is tying up all the loose ends from the former way of life, from the current world in which we live. He's like tying up all the loose ends and judging everything and assigning people to where they go. And it's all fair and right and just based off their actions and also based off whether or not they invited Jesus into their life. And he's kind of doing all that. And verse 14 says this, then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. So death as a concept, as an idea, is being deliberately destroyed and banished from this world. This is how seriously God takes the damage that has come about in people's lives because of death. God is saying, you know what? In my eternal kingdom, there will be no more death. Why? Because humans are once again properly connected to God. There's not going to be a sin impulse. There's not going to be a desire to wander away and do my own thing. And because of that, I'm reconnected to God forever. There's no more need of the consequence of death. So how about that for eternity? Never going to a funeral again. Never singing a sad song again. never sitting alone, feeling the loss of someone who you care about. In fact, if you miss them, I guarantee you'll be able to get on a plane or get on a car or run or walk, and you'll be able to go find them because they'll be there somewhere out in the new world doing something for God. Anytime you want to be reunited with somebody or catch up on what's been happening, you just go find them and you talk and you sit. And guess what? You've got eternity, so what are you in a hurry for? I think one of the glories of eternity is going to be this reunion that we have and this constant refreshing of all of our relationships and connecting with people and making new friends. And it's going to be amazing. But death has to be eliminated, right? Death has to be eliminated. So that way there's no expiration date on us. We get to live forever. But then also he mentions this here in verse 4. He says, neither shall there be mourning nor crying nor pain anymore. And I want to define that this way, specifically as these are the two blanks, grief and pain will be banished. Grief and pain will be banished. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about life in this world, life in this universe, is that we actually cry for a lot of reasons, right? Sometimes we cry because we feel a sense of loss, right? We have something, it's taken away from us. We didn't want it to be taken away from us. We cry as we feel the grief of that separation. But you know what? There's a lot of other kinds of crying that has nothing to do with grief. Maybe if and again, a thinker who's really smart, like a C.S. Lewis type, maybe he can go back and figure out how all the different forms of crying are really connected to grief in some way. I'm just not that smart. I know that sometimes when I look at my kids and I see how amazing they are and how loving they are and how strong they are and how smart they are and how just I see their true nature, like I well up. I cry. When they do something I'm proud of, man, sometimes I can't stop the tears from coming, right? Sometimes I look at a beautiful painting or I experience a beautiful piece of music or I experience a beautiful movie or something that kind of sweeps me away artistically. I cry. But it's not because of a sense of loss. It's a sense of wonder and joy and amazement. And I just cry because it's just so overwhelming. It's so beautiful. There's different reasons why we cry. I don't think what this is saying is that we'll be incapable of crying for joy, crying out of a sense of delight, crying out of a sense of oneness and intimacy, even crying at a sense of overwhelmedness at the beauty of something. Like all those good reasons why we cry, I don't think God is saying, nope, when you get to heaven, you're going to be a robot. You will not feel things the way you do now. You will not emote the way you do now. And again, if he wants to, I suppose that could be the case. But it seems to me that he's specifically drawing a big circle around a certain kind of crying. And I know this, I think, because he connects it to the idea of mourning and pain. Mourning and pain. And in the middle is crying, right? So what I think he's banishing all the crying that you do because of mourning, which is loss. I've lost something that I want and I can't get it back. And pain, ouch, 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 this hurts and I can't stop the pain and so the tears flow, right? Those kinds of crying he's going to banish because there's no more grief, there's no more pain. There's no more of that sense of loss because again, that belongs to the old life. That belongs to the sin-soaked and sin-cursed world. That belongs to the world where death is still a reality. If you get death out of the picture, all of a sudden there's no reason to mourn because you're not really losing anything. You never really lose anything. And there's no need to cry from pain because there's not going to be any excessive pain that can't be relieved or can't be fixed or can't be healed. Now, here's another question that I have, and this is honestly a question. I don't really know. Will I be able to, in heaven, in eternity, in God's eternal world, is my physical body just not going to have the limitations that it has right now, right? So, if I hit this enough times, eventually I'm going to cause a bruise. And then when I look at that, I remember when I hit that thing when I shouldn't have. Now, that's not grieving a loss or some unbearable pain. It's a pain that can be fixed, and over time, right, it heals, And I just have the memory, oh man, I got to be careful because last time when I whacked myself. In God's new world, it's possible that when I hit something, it's just not going to hurt. But I don't think heaven means that you're going to cease feeling things. And maybe I'm overthinking this. It's very possible, but we're not going to feel these negative emotions and unbearable pain. But if you're building something in the new world and your hand slips and you hit your thumb with the hammer or whatever tools we have then that maybe are way more efficient and effective, will we still cry out in pain and go, ow? And then the pain is subsiding and the pain heals and we kind of go, oh boy. Because again, I don't think Scripture says anywhere that we're going to be these automatons that walk around and don't feel anything anymore and just this blissful, like we're on some kind of a psychedelic drug that sort of just turns everything into this wonderful, cool rainbow, man. Like, I just don't think that's the case. We're going to be doing stuff. We're going to talk about this later. We're going to be doing stuff in the new world. We're going to be building stuff. We're going to be going places. We're going to be doing things. Would there be some way that we wouldn't accidentally bump into something and hurt ourselves temporarily? If we hurt ourselves, we'll instantly be healed? Or is it possible that our bodies are just so durable, they're so strong that you throw it up against a wall, you beat your head against the wall and it doesn't hurt because your head is built to be strong enough to withstand that without pain? I don't know. All I know is that pain is a warning system, right? Pain is a warning system from our body that says, don't do that. Don't do that. You have limitations, human. You can't go beyond a certain point or you will die. That's kind of what pain does. Pain is actually, now I know some pain can get out of control and it's kind of like that annoying buzzing that won't go away even after you get the message, But as a warning system, it's a pretty effective one because when you start to feel pain, you start to change behavior. You just do. So pain is a blessing and a gift. But again, that only works in a world where you have sin and disease and death. If there's no sin, disease, or death, then all you're talking about is, incidental contact with things. Can we jump off of cliffs, hit the ground, and Wile E. Coyote, bounce back up again and keep walking? Are there going to be laws of physics? Are there going to be laws of gravity? I don't know the answer to some of these questions, but I certainly am interested in them. But either way, at the very least, what we know is that the kind of pain, the kind of crying that is associated with out of control pain from sickness or loss or whatever, and the out of control crying that comes from mourning and loss and grief, those kinds of experiences will be banished. You'll never sit alone in a corner of your home in eternity, curled up in a fetal position, crying over the losses of your past. Now, this is good for some of us to know. And it goes along with the God wiping away every tear kind of a thing. Because a lot of us feel, what's the word? We feel marred by sin, tainted by sin, or even just tainted by grief, tainted by pain. And we really can't imagine ourselves without that. We can't imagine what it would be like to not feel those horrible things. And sometimes it actually works against us because we stay sick longer than we need to stay. I don't mean physically, but more emotionally and spiritually. Like we hold ourselves in a place of shame longer than we should because we just can't picture what life without shame would look like, right? What would it be like where I don't have that memory of that person who hurt me in that specific way, and I don't feel the guilt or don't feel the hurt and the pain and the loss and the grief? Well, someday we're going to find out. That's what I mentioned last week. And I think also, too, we can take comfort from the fact that we're never going to be in a position where we're weeping because of a loss again. We're never going to weep because of unbearable pain anymore. God's going to fix those problems, and there won't be any of that in his presence. And one last thing, interesting detail. And this is, I geek out about this stuff because it connects back to earlier scriptures. Take a look at Revelation chapter 22, verses, I'll just read verses 1 and 2 to give you a little context. It says, "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life," we'll come back to that, "bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb," verse 2, "through the middle of the street of the city," right? So picture, somehow God's throne in the center, I guess, of the city. It's usually where these things are built. There's God's throne in the center of the city. From God's throne flows out this river in all directions, river of the water of life. And it flows down through the streets. So it's going to be like Venice, right? Streets of water kind of flowing through here. Or at least, water and then streets next to it, or I don't know exactly how it's going to be. And then it says this, verse 2. Also, on either side of the river, the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The tree of life. Now, where have I heard of a tree of life before? I got it. Genesis chapter 2. In this garden God makes for humanity before sin, before death, before all that sort of horrible stuff. There's the two trees that are named, right? Tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Then there's the tree of life. Really interesting thing. The only one God prohibits is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God does not prohibit the tree of life. Not to Adam or Eve when they're still innocent before they've sinned. Apparently, sinless humanity can eat from the tree of life, and it's a good thing. It's at least permissible. But not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. See, that's the test. Do you trust me or don't you? Do you really believe I have your best interests at heart or don't you? Obviously, humanity fails that test. We've talked about it ad nauseum. Well, here we come to the end of the story. And what do we have lining the river side on both sides going through the middle of this city? We have the tree of life. And apparently, it's not a single tree of life. It's a orchard of trees of life. Because this tree, or unless it's one giant tree that stretches its limbs throughout according to the course of this river. But I picture in my head an orchard of trees of life. And it's producing fruit. And what is fruit for? And again, this ties back so much to Genesis chapter 3. Fruit is for the satisfaction of your hungers, right? Your desires, your needs. And there's 12 different kinds, apparently. There's different fruit. Each month you'll get a different fruit. So there's variety. For our palate, God doesn't just say, here, have this, wafer tablet for the rest of eternity. That'll keep you alive. No. This is going to be a sumptuous, delicious experience and meal. But then he says this, the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Tree of life. You know what's really interesting? In the garden, after Adam and Eve sinned, God kicked them out of the garden. Do you remember that story? He said, you can't come back. And he put a cherubim as like a giant angel with a flaming, blazing sword. I'm not sure exactly what that looks like. But an angel with a sword that was on fire that guarded the way, not to the garden, but to the tree of life. Because it seems that if fallen humanity had eaten of the tree of life after eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then something irrevocable would have happened. Something that would have damaged the story beyond what God could redeem. I know it's kind of hard to believe, but it seems like this is the case. Because God kicks Adam and Eve out of the garden, out into the wilderness, not simply to punish them, say, well, you can't have the nice stuff anymore. That's not what he's doing. He's trying to protect them from their natural desire to continue to eat from the tree of life. Because eating of the tree of life in their current state, apparently, is something that God doesn't even want to contemplate. And so God says, I'm kicking them out into the wilderness. And you know what? It has been a miserable, who knows how many thousand years out in the wilderness, hasn't it? We try to recreate the Garden of Eden all the time, and we fail. We go on vacations to these beautiful spots, and they're great, and they're wonderful. But guess what? If you're there, it stops being special. Eventually, the vacation runs out. Eventually, you have to go home. Eventually, this happens and that happens. And we try to recreate the garden, and we can't. We can't. In our fallenness and our brokenness, we can't fix what has been broken. We can't get back what we've lost. Except, of course, Once we finally get to the new heaven and the new earth, Jesus has come. He's healed us of our sin, but also the Father has wiped all of our tears away. He's banished death. He's banished mourning and loss and crying and all that horrible things. And then all of a sudden he says, okay, guys, all the things that made it bad for you humans to eat from the tree of life and to enjoy that and to be sustained by it, those things are gone. So go have at it. Go crazy. Come on back. It's like we're back in the garden again, and we can eat from the tree of life. We're no longer exiled out into the wilderness. We can come back into the garden, and the garden now takes the form of this amazing city, and we can come right in. We can drink from the water of life. We can eat from the tree of life. There's no more barriers. We have been completely, the leaves, even the leaves of the tree, eucalyptus leaves, you kind of break them, and in the breaking, there's a fluid that helps heal wounds and so on. This tree of life, every part of it is going to provide satisfaction and nourishment and, yes, healing to all of us. So, intimacy, that's one guardrail so that our imaginations don't run wild about eternity in a way God wouldn't want us to. And then another guardrail on the side is healing. We know for a fact that we will be completely healed. Everything that was damaging and hurtful from our old way of life will be banished from this new world, and we will not have to deal with it anymore. We will be completely healed, fixed, put back together. But even that's not enough for God. I don't know about you. I would take that. If that's all I got, just stop me hurting the way I hurt now. I would most days out of 10, 9.5 days out of 10, I'd take that deal. Just to have so far intimacy and healing, I would take that. But God's like, no, that's not enough. That's not enough. There's more. There's more that I want you to have. Look at verse 5 of Revelation 21, 5 and 6. And he who was seated on the throne said, behold, and I want you to picture him rubbing his hands together like this. I want you to picture him with like something that's like covered by a sheet because he hasn't wanted us to see it so far. And I want you to picture the excitement and the delight when he grabs the edge of that sheet and he rips it off to show us this new thing he's been making. He's excited. He says, behold, I'm making all things new. All things, everything, brand new life. Also, he said, write this down, John. Don't let them miss this, John. Let this be a guardrail for them, John, in their imagination about what eternity will be like. John, they need to know this. These words are trustworthy and true. And he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty, I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. What are we going to get? The third thing, and fill in the blanks here, we're going to get a brand new start. A brand new start. We get to experience, here's the next blank, life as God always intended for us to experience it. The sad reality is that you, even on your best day, have never experienced life the way God intends for you to experience it. Did you know this? Your very best day falls short of what God intended for you, because even on your very best day, you have to deal with sin that battles you on the inside. You have to deal with a world system that's opposed to God, even though it's still beautiful and wonderful in many respects. You still have to deal with an enemy called Satan who's attacking you from the outside. You still have to deal with corruption and pollution and aging and your mind not working the way it used to, your body not working the way it used to, your face not looking like it used to. You have to deal with all this stuff. You've never experienced life the way it was meant to be lived, the way God intended. There's only been 2 humans who have ever experienced that, Adam and Eve. And that was only for a short time before they literally threw it in the toilet and hit the flush button. But this, we get it back. We get it back. And then he talks about the water of life. And the idea is that we will drink deeply. Here's the last blank of this section here. We will drink deeply of complete satisfaction. Satisfaction. Friends, eternity is going to be God's do-over. Do-over, right? I don't play golf. I don't pretend to play golf. I would be horrible at golf, I suspect. But people who do golf, sometimes they take that first shot off the tee and it's pretty bad. it just slices off, or maybe they miss the ball completely, or they barely nudge it and it kind of skips a couple of feet. You know what? Instead of just going up and hitting it from there and having their second shot, sometimes they do what's called a mulligan, I think is what the expression is in the business. And they reach down and kind of grab the ball and put it back on the tee, and they pretend like they're going to hit it, and they get a better shot, hopefully the second time. It's a do-over. It's like a start over. It's like, okay, yeah, that one didn't go so good. That wouldn't go according to plan, so let's try again. That's what eternity is going to be like. So what's the key word here? The key word here is not intimacy. It's not healing. The key word is satisfaction. And the imagery God uses is the water of life. But that's obvious because water has always been associated with life, hasn't it? If you're wandering around in the desert, what do you want more than you want $1 billion? You want a glass of water, or a fountain, a spring of water. If you don't have water, you don't have life. Even on a much smaller scale, if you've been working outside and you're severely, water deprived, you go inside and that tall drink of cool, refreshing, wet water, as it goes down into your innards, and it just does something to you. It brings you back to life. When you wake up in the morning, we do something, we usually put coffee or whatever, but the big refreshing water. When you want to wake up, right? The big joke is you take some water and you splash it on the person, because cold water especially, it just kind of, as a shock to the system, it brings you back. So when he says, I'm going to let you drink from the spring of the water of life without payment, it's not going to cost you a thing. You're not going to have to earn your way into this. As a gift of my grace, I'm going to bathe you. I'm going to dump truckloads of the water of life. You are going to experience satisfaction. I'm sure you're not sinful enough to have listened to the Rolling Stones growing up. I'm sure that you avoided it and separated from it as you should have. But Mick Jagger was famous for writing a song saying, I can't get no satisfaction. Now, I want you to notice this. He never says in that song, I can't get no pleasure. I guarantee you Mick Jagger had enough money and fame and power to get plenty of pleasure. But what he didn't have was satisfaction. Satisfaction is that feeling that says, you know what? I have enough. That's enough. That's enough to sustain me. I can go about my life and live my life and do my thing, and I can be who I'm supposed to be, and I can do what I'm supposed to do because I had a need, I had a thirst, I had a hunger, and I did something to that. I put something into my life, and I got what I need, and I'm fine, and now I can go back to doing the stuff I was supposed to do before. Mick Jagger couldn't find satisfaction. He sure could find plenty of pleasure, but not satisfaction. Eternity, friends, is God saying it's time for satisfaction. I mentioned vacations before. We look forward to vacations, and we should. We look forward to fun experiences, and we should. But oftentimes they don't live up to the hype. Or if they do, it's over too quickly. Have you noticed that? You have this great experience, but then the next day you got to get in your car and drive home. And home, not satisfying. Even on our best days, our best experiences, they don't satisfy the thirst forever, right? That's why Jesus is talking to the woman at the well who has to come every day in the blazing hot sun because she doesn't want to be around women at her, in her condition at the early part of the day. So she goes in the blazing hot sun to get water, and she's there, and she's like, hey, give me something to drink. And she's like, why would you ask me for something to drink? And Jesus pulls a fast one on her, and he says, hey, if you knew who I was, you'd ask me, and I'd give you water, and you'll never thirst again. Satisfaction, right? So anyway, that's the gig. That's the promise. Jesus says, if you give me your life, I will satisfy you. And in this life, we get little bits and pieces of satisfaction, but you know what? We don't get it all. In eternity, we're going to get complete satisfaction. Now notice here in verse 5 and 6, it says, God will give the inhabitants of his kingdom the water of life for free. For free. In other words, there's no charge. There's no cost. There's no price tag. There's no amount of money you have to pay. There's no moral good deeds that you have to do to get access to this water of life. You just get it, and you get to enjoy it forever. And again, this reminds me once again of Eden. This reminds me once again of the garden. You know, in the garden, Adam had all of his needs provided for by God. Adam didn't pay to stay in the Garden of Eden. There was no rent. There's no mortgage. Adam just simply lived there, and God as his father and as his sovereign provided for him. And the same picture goes here. God in his grace is going to give us satisfaction for free. We're not going to have to trade anything for satisfaction. We're just going to be the gloriously wonderful, resilient recipients of his incredible, overwhelming satisfaction. Now, we've already looked at chapter 22, verses 1 and 2 about the river of the water of life, but let's go back. 22, verse 1, then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, through the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of the life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Now, this is interesting because the river is not just flowing to the people in the city. It says it's going to have healing for the nations. Well, the nations are outside there. They're out in the wilderness, so to speak. They're out beyond the scope of this city. Out there, the healing, apparently the river of life is going to flow, spread out from all directions out into the entire world. And in a sense, is going to be the power for this new world, this source of life for everyone. So like, for example, in the Garden of Eden, if you remember, there's this really weird detail that he sticks in there. He talks about these 4 rivers, and 2 of them we recognize, the Tigris and the Euphrates. But there's these other 2. One was called the Pishon, and one was called the blah, blah, blah. Can't remember. But there's 4 rivers, and the way that the Bible tells the story is that they water all 4 corners. So like they're all starting from a apparently central location, and they flow out in 4 different directions to basically water the entire garden and take care of that place. Well, apparently this is sort of like that. The river of the water of life comes from God's presence, from his throne, which makes sense, of course, right? Because he's the water of life. He is the source of life. So the river is going to come from God and going to spread, I think, all throughout the entire world. These rivers are going to trace, all the way into the forgotten corners of this new world that God has made. And all the people that live out there, and we'll talk about them in a minute, but all the people in this new world are going to be able to drink from that water of life whenever they want, free of charge. So that's the blank there. God will give the inhabitants of his kingdom the water of life for free. And then under 22, 1 and 2, river of the water of life flowing out of the city for all, for everyone. There's no limits to this. God is going to give satisfaction through this water of life to everyone who lives on it. And it's going to refresh us and satisfy us and equip us and enable us to live and to do the things that God wants us to do, which of course we are going to talk about in just a few minutes, maybe next week. But anyway, interesting thing. We've already talked about it. It was a while ago though, so I don't blame you if you've forgotten. But the book of Ezekiel is a book of prophetic visions about the future, and especially about the future of the people of Israel. And it talks about a new temple that God will build at the end of time. That's going to be like Solomon's temple, but better, because God's going to live there again. And it's going to be bigger than the old temple was. And then it talks in Ezekiel 47 about water that flows from this new temple. I want to read this to you because it's kind of bizarre and kind of crazy. And I remember for most of my life did not know this was in the Bible. And I want you to know it because it connects perfectly to what John says here in Revelation chapter 22. Verse 47 says this, then he, that's an angel, brought me back to the door of the temple, and behold, water was issuing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east. The water was flowing down from below the south end, south of the altar. Verse 2, then he brought me out by way of the north gate and led me around on the outside to the outer gate that faces toward the east. And behold, the water was trickling out on the south side. So water is trickling out from the temple that he pictures in the New Jerusalem someday. this new world, this new dwelling place of God, where God's going to live. I think the new city, the new Jerusalem, he pictures also water. So this is a common Old Testament picture that once God establishes his home in this new temple on a new earth, there's going to be this water that trickles out. Now, if you go to verses 3 and to verse 6, he basically measures out how deep the water is. And the further you go from the temple, the deeper and deeper it gets. It was deep enough to swim in, it says in verse 5. And then he says, Son of man, verse 6, have you seen this? Then he led me back to the bank of the river. As I went, I saw on the bank of the river, what does he see? Very many trees on the one side and on the other. Well, what does that sound like? It's exactly what John describes in Revelation 22, verse 2. The tree of life on both sides of the river. And it says this, verse 8. And he said to me, this water flows toward the eastern region, goes down into the Arabah, enters the sea. When the water flows into the sea, the water will become fresh. And wherever the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live. Why? Because it's the water of life. It's the water that brings satisfaction in life. And there will be many, very many fish. For this water goes there, that the waters of the sea may become fresh. So everything will live where the river goes. Did you catch that? Fresh water versus salt water. Some things are equipped to live in salt water, some things are not. Humans, for example, die if you put us in salt water. You put us in regular water, we can, as long as we can breathe, we can survive and even thrive. But not salt water. And this is going to turn all the salt water in the world to fresh water. And everywhere the water goes, things will live. I love that. I love that. And John picks up on that in Revelation 22 and says it's happening here. In this new Jerusalem, the water that flows out is where the everything will live where the river goes. Verse 10, fishermen will stand beside the sea, so on and so forth. Verse 11, its swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They're to be left for salt. Okay, and on the banks, on both sides of the river, there will grow all kinds of trees for food. The 12 kinds of fruit, right? Their leaves will not wither, nor their fruit fail, but they will bear fresh fruit every month because the water for them flows from the sanctuary. In other words, you constantly have times of harvesting because there's constantly a fresh source of life. It's not like in our world today where there's cycles, right? And there's a yearly cycle. There's a time to produce fruit, and there's a time to wait in the winter, and so on and so forth. Well, here, that is accelerated, and every single month they're going to go through this process and produce more fruit. Their fruit will be for food, and look at this, their leaves for healing. So what's Ezekiel doing, and what's John doing? He's going back to Ezekiel 47, saying, you know that temple where God is going to live? It's actually a city, and it's called New Jerusalem. And as it spills out from the throne, it's going to take life everywhere and bring satisfaction wherever it goes. This, in Revelation 22, is the fulfillment of the vision here in Ezekiel 47. Now, Zechariah 14, I don't blame you if this is a hard one to find. It's the second to last book in the Bible. And we looked at it before. We were describing kind of the final battle that Jesus will fight to destroy his enemies. But here in chapter 14, verse 8 says, on that day, living waters shall flow out of Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter. So living waters, once again, flowing from Jerusalem out into the world. And then, of course, there's one last reference in Joel chapter 3. Joel is another one of the minor prophets. Joel 3:18 says this, and in that day the mountains shall drip sweet wine, and the hills shall flow with milk, and all the stream beds of Judah will flow with water, and a fountain shall come forth from the house of the Lord and water the valley of Shittim. Water. In a world that is starved for water, as Israel was throughout and still is throughout its history, water is life. Water is satisfaction. Water is what gives me the resources I need to live my life. And God is going to provide that for all the members of his kingdom in abundance. In abundance. And we'll get to participate in that. So, 3 things, right? Intimacy, we talked about it last week. Healing, we talked about that last week a little bit, a lot today. And then satisfaction. These are 3 guardrails so that we know that when our imaginations imagine eternity, they're on firm ground. When we imagine intimacy, healing, and satisfaction. Now, again, there's so many details that we don't know. Like, how will this happen? The leaves are for the healing of the nation. What does that mean? I don't know. All I know is that it's going to happen. And so my imagination can run a little bit wild, imagining how the leaves of the tree of life can be used. My imagination can run wild, imagining what the fruit tastes like, imagining whether or not we'll eat anything besides fruit. Perhaps the fruit will be so satisfying and nourishing and to our souls and to our bodies that maybe we won't hunger for some of the things that we hunger for anymore because we've gotten something even better. So I don't know about all of that. All I know is that God has said there will be intimacy, there will be healing, there will be satisfaction. And God's going to fill in the details. And this is the good news, friends, right? Because God is going to fill in the details, we can trust him to fill details in a way that will please us and make us be filled with joy. Now, that doesn't mean that God is required to do anything the way you want him to do it. That's not the point. The point is that God is still free to go above and beyond. Sometimes, and again, I wish this was more often, I wish I was a better parent, but sometimes when I've planned to do fun things with my kids, I know that they have certain expectations in their heads. And so I want to make sure as a parent that if we're going to go, say, to the apple orchard, or we're going to go to the ball field, or we're going to go watch this, or we're going to do that, we're going to go to Acadia National Park. That's like our new summer thing that we do. I want to make sure we fulfill the expectations of what they were hoping for, right? Otherwise, it's a disappointment. They're like, oh, normally we go to Acadia, we go on the one hike, and we didn't go this year. And obviously, you want to measure up to and meet their expectations. But one of the funnest things about being a parent is dropping new, unexpected things that they don't see coming to make the experience even better, even more precious, even more sweet. I think heaven's going to be like that, eternity. I hope you. I don't mean to say heaven because that's very misleading. Eternity in God's new heaven and new earth, it's going to be like that. There's these things that God is making sure that we expect. We're going to expect intimacy. We're going to expect healing. We're going to expect satisfaction. I guarantee you there's going to be extra surprises we don't know about to make the experience even more delightful, even more joyous. God is going to keep surprising us on into eternity. Think about your life in relationship with God. Have you been surprised at any point along the way? Now, sure, you've been surprised by negative things that have happened, but have you ever been surprised by good things that have happened to you? I suspect you probably have, right? Well, if that's the case, why wouldn't you expect that maybe in eternity, God might surprise you a little bit more? And I don't know about you, sometimes it's the surprises that are even better than the things I was expecting. Trying a new food and going, oh my word, I missed this. Okay, this is embarrassing, but I'm just going to come right out and say it. I did not eat eggs until I was an adult. I know, right? Like, crazy. I always thought it was super gross, and my mom just didn't make it, and maybe she was like worried that we wouldn't eat it or whatever. Probably I was a pretty picky eater. So I take all the blame for this, okay? I'm not blaming anybody. But I just never ate eggs. My dad sometimes would eat eggs, and I'd be like, not so much, thanks. Because I think he grew up in a family that ate eggs all the time. And so it was kind of his thing, but it wasn't really my thing, and I didn't really even want to try it. And then I met this girl. And she took me to visit her grandparents' house, and her grandfather was kind of it's a big deal. And every breakfast that we were there, it was a big deal when the kids or the grandkids came around was to make scrambled eggs. It's a big deal. And it was a certain way that it had to be prepared, a certain way to do it, certain little things to add at certain little points. And he was the same way with mashed potatoes, by the way. And I thought, you know what? It looks interesting. It smells good. I'll just try a little bit. Well, I tried a little bit. And the taste and the glory that exploded in my mouth at that moment when he had prepared his special eggs, I think they were cheesy eggs, the way he did, I'm like, how have I missed this my entire life? And ever since then, honestly, I've been a sucker for scrambled eggs. I'm still not crazy about the other ways to do eggs. I still haven't kind of gotten into that. But I really love scrambled eggs, and I eat them whenever I can. My mom, she's watching this. I'm sure she still kind of rolls her eyes going like, why didn't this kid figure this out sooner? But I didn't. I was in my 30s, or no, my late 20s before I finally figured out that eggs, scrambled eggs especially, were yummy. Everything that we've talked about is just sort of the appetizer, I think. It's sort of like the basic bottom line. Okay, don't worry, these things are going to be there. There's going to be all kinds of stuff piled on top that we don't see coming. And God loves to surprise his people. He loves to bring unexpected good out of bad, but I think he also just likes to surprise us with blessings and gifts. He's a giving God. This is his nature. Have we figured this out about him by now? I hope so. I hope we've figured out, what he's like by this point in our lives. But anyway, what was that all about? I don't know. All I know is that God's going to give satisfaction. I'm going to try to tackle one more, and then we're going to finish up the last one next week. So here we go. You ready? I'll just read the passage. Go back to Revelation 21, please. Revelation 21, verse 9. So verse 9 says this: Then came one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues. Like, these are dudes you don't want to mess with, right? Like, they're the ones that unleashed the final plagues on the earth we talked about at length. These dudes are buff. Like, they're intense. And he spoke to me saying, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. Listen to this. Having the glory of God. That's the very first thing that he notices about this city, is that it glows with the glory of God, right? Its radiance like a most rare jewel. If you've ever seen pictures of like the crown jewels of England and just the glitter and the shininess that's reflected, the colored light that reflects off these diamonds and rubies and all these other fancy rocks that I don't know what they're called, amethyst and things like that, jasper, carnelian, lapis lazuli if you're from Chile. It's that blue rock that's just incredibly beautiful. Anyway, as it's coming down out of heaven, the light is glowing and it's reflecting off of this city. It's like a giant jewel. Like jasper, clear as crystal. Somehow it's clear, it's transparent. The color, I don't get it. I don't even know enough about beauty and about art and about colors to really even comment super intelligently on this, except to say that this is something unlike you've ever seen. Like this whatever this is built out of, it has a substance and a composition unlike anything in this planet, transparent in some way, that allows you to see all these differences of color. Verse 12, it had a great high wall with 12 gates. And at the gates were 12 angels, and on the gates the name of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel were inscribed. Gates are ways in and out of things, right? Now we find out later in chapter 22, the gates never close. So it's kind of like the question, the eternal question, do 7-Elevens are open 24/7, right? So do they bother to even put locks on the doors if they're supposed to be open 24/7? Like, in my mind, I'm like, okay, so why do you have gates? I suppose you could just call them holes, right? Holes in the wall. But apparently they have these majestic gates. And these gates are never closed. So they're always open, but there's 12 gates, and each gate apparently has an angel entrusted to that particular gate, to be the warden of that gate, I guess. And on each gate is one of the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. That shows continuity with the people of God in the Old Testament. So righteous, faithful, trusting in God and in his provision Jews who lived and died under that Old Testament dispensation and sort of arrangement that God had, they will be well represented in this new city. And in fact, their 12 tribes are going to be emblazoned on the gates on their way into the city. So that's a big deal. And then it says here, verse 13, on the east, 3 gates, on the north, 3 gates, on the south, 3 gates, and on the west, 3 gates. Verse 14, and the wall of the city, so the wall around, so you got the gates, those are the 12 tribes of Israel. Then there's this wall around that connects all these gates together, had 12 foundations. And on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So 12 apostles, their names. So not only does this represent the home of the Old Testament saints who lived and died under that arrangement God had, but then you have the church is represented here as well. And not only represented, but they're the foundation, they're the building blocks are these 12 apostles. And John, ironically, the person who's writing about it, he's one of those 12 guys. His name is going to be held in reverence as one of the foundation, one of the cornerstones, the foundation blocks of the wall of the city of God living on earth among us. I mean, it's crazy. So we have Israel is represented, the church is represented, and then keep going. Verse 15, and the one who spoke with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and its walls. Now, again, I'm not going to get into all this because, frankly, I don't totally understand why John is going to this extent, except that in Ezekiel, remember we looked at Ezekiel 47, we saw the water coming from the temple going out into the city, and it's got the tree of life on both sides and all that. In Ezekiel, right before he sees the water coming out and spreading life everywhere it goes, he also measures out the size and the proportion of the new temple and the dimensions of it to kind of give you a sense of the scope of it. And so an angel goes around with some kind of a measuring stick, a rod, and measures it out. So once again, John is deliberately connecting this New Jerusalem to the temple Ezekiel was talking about in Ezekiel 47. But then we get this description, and it's kind of a little bit boring. But it's kind of interesting as well, especially if you're an engineer. This probably lights your fire a little bit. Had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and its walls. The city lies 4 squares. It's a giant square. Its length was the same as its width, right? So it's perfectly square all the way around. And he measured the city with his rod, 12,000 stadia. Now, this is the part where people think that this is all metaphorical and not literal at all. And I understand why. Because when you translate stadia, right, 12,000 stadia into miles, what you get is about 1,380 miles. Now, I've lived in big cities, and big cities that took up a lot of space. But no city that exists in the world has walls that run in a circumference of 1,380 miles. That's not a thing. So people assume that that means that this is just sort of a metaphorical thing. It doesn't really, I think it's possible this is just a giant city, the size of which, I mean, is the city that God lives in going to be small, right? If it's got room and home for the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles in the church that's represented by them, it's got to have some space to it. So I presume that this is probably speaking, I don't have any good reason to think this is not real and literal. So I'm picturing a giant city that stretches 1,380 miles. It's a whole region. It's not even a city. It's a region. But notice this is also interesting. Its length and width and height are equal. It's not just a square, it's a box, apparently. These walls go up as far as they go out. Just shows you the scope and the size of this city in this world. It's just ginormous. Incredible. And again, do I understand totally how that works? No. He also measured its wall 144 cubits by human measurement, which is also an angel's measurement. Why that's put in there, I don't know. Apparently the angels have a different measuring system than we do, but apparently in this case it matched up. The wall was built of jasper, while the city was pure gold like clear glass. Now, hold on a second here. Pure gold, the way I know it, right? And I've got a little piece of pure gold here to show you. This pure gold reflects light. I can look at it and I can see a very twisted, kind of squished down version of me, okay? But it's not clear. It doesn't allow light to pass through it it hits it and then it bounces back to me. That's why I can see my reflection, even if it's not a great reflection. Well, in my case, it wouldn't be great either way. But it's not clear. Somehow, this pure gold that the city is made out of is also clear and transparent as glass, which is crazy. The foundations of the wall of the city, remember the 12 foundations, the 12 apostles, were adorned with every kind of jewel. The first was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth carnelian, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, the 11th jacinth, and the 12th amethyst. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls, each of the gates made of a single pearl. And the street of the city was pure gold, like transparent glass. So, yeah, that's a lot to take in, isn't it? But here's the crazy thing. I think that's exactly the point. It's a lot to take in. It overwhelms the senses. At some point, you stop trying to figure out what that looks like, and you just say, well, I'll have to see it with my own two eyes. Like, I've had this happen sometimes where people describe incredible places, right? They go, oh, the Grand Canyon. Toby, you've got to see the Grand Canyon. And they try to describe it to me, and I'm like, okay, sounds like a big hole in the ground, and it's deep, I get that, and it's far, and there's all kinds of different rock formations, and that's impressive. But there's something else about standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon and looking over into it, seeing the river that's down in the base of it, and all of the incredible, like being there, right? The beauty and the awe of it just blows you away. I think what John is trying to do is he's trying to say, hey, look, when I saw this place, I was blown away. Blown away in beauty. In the beauty of it all. Now, here's the thing that I do not want to do. I do not want to try to find some spiritual meaning for each one of these different kinds of jewels or crystals, right? Like, emerald is green, and so that represents the jealousy that God has overcome, or or something like that. Or I don't want to be like, oh, here's topaz. Well, that represent. I'm not into that. I don't think, unless the text tells me what the various things mean, or it refers to another passage that explains what these things mean, they're just meant to be decorative. It's just meant to say, it's going to be beautiful, y'all. It's going to be amazing. It's going to blow you away. Like, I've never seen the Mona Lisa. I've seen pictures of the Mona Lisa, and I'm like, eh. But to go to, I think it's in Paris, to go to the Louvre and to look at the Mona Lisa hanging on the wall is to experience it in a way that I would never experience it, just a description of it. And that's what eternity is going to be like. That's what heaven's going to be like. We're going to be, and here's the blank I want you to put in here, okay? We will bathe in the beauty of God's breathtaking glory. We will bathe in the beauty of God's breathtaking glory. So what's the fourth key word that we need to keep in mind? The fourth key word is this: beauty. Beauty. I guarantee you, when you are in God's new heaven and new earth, there will be times you just sit and look at everything. And you probably are not going to be capable of rational thought. You're going to have that emotional reaction that we have when we come into contact with a work of art that is so amazing that it leaves us breathless and speechless. And the New Jerusalem is just the city in the middle of this new whole world that God has made. And sure, it's the one Jesus has been preparing for us. And so I'm sure it's got lots of bells and whistles, and it's very beautiful, more beautiful than anything else in the world up until that point at least. But we're going to see beauty everywhere we go. This experience of eternity is going to be one that is soaked in beauty. We're going to take a bath in it. We're never going to come to the end of the beauty. And here's the thing. You know how when you're a kid, you remember something as being really cool, and then you come back as an older person, and you're like, I was clearly seeing it with childish eyes, and now that I see it with the eyes of an adult, it's diminished in some way. I guarantee you, there is no way that beauty can be diminished by us. We're never going to look at it and go, you know what, boy, that was pretty cool the first time, but now this 700th time I've looked at this wall, this gate, this this gate that apparently is made of a single pearl, right? It's crazy. What kind of clam would that have to come out of? But the idea is there's this artistry. It's beauty. It's been crafted. It's been shaped, and the beauty will have us just in awe. I don't know if you've ever experienced this or not, but sometimes I just hunger and ache for beauty. There's like a hole inside of me that can only be filled by beautiful things. And when I'm feeling that way, I go for walks in nature. I want to go somewhere to see something. I go to an art museum. I go to even just looking through old photographs. I'm searching for that beautiful arrangement of something, whether it's something man-made or something God-made. And I just want to see it because there's something about the beauty of it that is restorative to my soul. When we get to eternity, beauty is going to be a major part of what we do and what it's all about. And next week, we're going to wrap up this idea about beauty, and we're going to also talk about, okay, so what are we going to do in the new heaven and the new earth? I love you guys. We'll see you next week.